Hello and welcome to Not the New Normal, the podcast that explores why people buy and how to motivate them to buy from you. People are complex, of that there is no doubt. However, the way we make decisions may not be, in that the architecture that triggers and motivates those decisions is fairly simple and straightforward. My partner in crime on these podcasts, Martin Lucas, has spent 4 years decoding decision making and now helps brands to achieve huge growth by deploying the secrets he's discovered. On today's podcast, Martin reveals all about his journey, the people that inspired him along the way, and the secrets that he's unlocked. Once again, I'm joined by my co-host, Martin Lucas. Hi, Martin. Great to have you here.
Hi, Alex. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thank you. Beautiful sunny day outside. Now, Martin, Dale Carnegie, the legendary author of How to Win Friends and Influence People, said that to influence, you must first earn the right to do so. So I thought that we'd spend the next couple of episodes doing just that. Today, we're going to focus on you. Now, you spent your early career smashing it in B2B sales, for which you've won numerous awards. And today, you're more focused on the B2B sphere and have developed an approach that's enabling brands to add double-digit and at times triple-digit growth to their online sales. It's an approach that's been many years in the making. And today, we're going to explore your story and share some of the key insights that's enabling you to achieve these results for your clients. There's a huge amount for us to discuss, but I thought we could start here, as it's likely something that people have not heard before. So you describe yourself as a mathematical psychologist. You're definitely the first that I've ever come across. What is that? What does it mean?
What does it mean is that it's a research capability of psychology, meaning that it's anchored around actually finding out lots of information from lots of other disciplines, other types of psychology, other types of science. And the reason being is that it's all anchored around human decision making. That's the core of what it is. Everything from psychophysics to memory to experience to why we do what we do. So it's the big anchor of decision making, and that's why I use it, because it's like a hidden gem. Because unlike most scientific disciplines or academic disciplines, normally they operate within a silo. Like a neuroscientist doesn't necessarily speak to a psychologist and things like that, whereas this one allowed me to really do what I wanted to do, which was to find out the truth of everything.
And so, what is the mathematical part of that? Because I can hear the psychology that you're talking about. Where does the mathematics come into it?
So the thing that I look at when it comes to mathematics is not the scary numbers or the actual math itself that scares lots of people. It's actually the fact that if you think about what we judge as irrational behavior, right? So all of us humans, 95% of our decisions are based on emotion. So we all do irrational things, right? But what does it actually mean to be irrational? It's only irrational when I'm judging you or you're judging me, right? Because to me, I'm just doing the normal things the way that Marty does stuff, right? So I might have tons of, well, and not just might, I do have tons of weird habits, right, for how I do different things. And I've always been a bit of a jack in the box, like I can't sit still and stuff like that. I'm quite an obsessive, so it means that I can be really interesting or really annoying, probably in the same sentence. Right? My point is that I've got all this weird stuff, right? But it's only weird when somebody else is judging me. To me, it's perfectly rational. And that's where I started in 2015, because I was like, let's forget about how the world operates for a second. This was me in 2015, and just say, if I could understand how Martin thinks as an individual, what is logical to him is irrational to somebody else, but it's logical to him. If I can understand what Alex does and why and what his logic is, then I can understand individual people. If I can understand individual people, I know what to serve them more of, what to serve them less of, and indeed when to leave them alone. And that was the birthplace for me of what I call irrational mathematics, which was the anchor of everything, is that I've used mathematical psychology to then figure out the mathematics that account for how individuals make their own decisions. Because at the end of the day, that's personalization, right? It's real. And I felt that at the time in 2015 that none of that existed in the world. I still don't think it exists, not unless you're a client of ours.
Well, so that's an interesting point, right? So you've talked there about meaning and about emotion and the way that people connect with brands and stuff. I'm paraphrasing you here, so correct me if I'm wrong. You've said that to get customers to buy and then buy more, you've got to understand them as human beings, and that where many of us believe that actually humans are quite complex, you maintain that people are actually pretty simple to understand. So if that's the case, why is it that people think differently? Well, why do we think people are complex and actually you believe they're quite simple?
It's a really great question. So I'll start with the counter answer is that I believe that humans are super complex. I believe that our brain is the most complex computer on this planet. What I've done,
Mm.
instead of saying I want to understand every single thing about Alex, instead of doing like a Cambridge Analytica or a Facebook assassination of everything that you do in the world and taking all this data from you, what I've done instead is said, well, that's just a broken system. Only 1.61% of Facebook ads get interacted with, and that's not me having to go at Facebook. It's a stat that I use a lot, but it's the same indicator of programmatic advertising, of retail behaviors, of email engagement, of e-commerce buying patterns. And the reason being is that what we're trying to do in the world in general is understand all this kind of stuff about people, right? You could understand all the weird stuff that I do as a person. I dress as a woman on a Friday evening and I party having cocktails while Alex is dressed as a woman. I'm making up half of that anyway. But my point is, right,
So you think? So you think? You should see my dresses. They're anyway.
my point is that it doesn't work, right? It doesn't work because
Right.
Facebook, one of the highest growing businesses and most successful businesses in the world, 98.39% of its adverts, which is its money tree, don't get interacted with. So it's not about understanding everything about the person, it's about context. If I understand how, let's
Hmm.
say that I'm a fashion brand, Lucas Garments, right? And if I understand that Alex likes me as a brand, and I understand what types of
Hmm.
products he likes, what type of style he likes, his frequency of purchase, what he likes within the experiences to purchase, and when he likes to buy, then I know what to serve him. I don't need to know Alex's home situation. I don't need to know the dresses he's got. I just need to know how he feels about me as a brand. And that's the big breakthrough stuff that we've got. That's why we're getting the double digit growth stuff, which you summarized super well. I'm going to borrow that in our go to market, by the way. I thought it was great.
Thank you very much. Well, to give us some insight into that. Okay, so you have a way in which you are able to understand people and the meaning that they assign. How does that bridge to double digit growth?
Well, if you think about let's think about your day-to-day life right now, right? Is how often are you getting served with emails that you ignore, with adverts that you don't look at, with things that you just don't care about? Like think about just the morning that you've had today. We're speaking on Wednesday lunchtime, right? Like how many things
Mm,
have you ignored today? Just take a guess, would you
yeah,
say, from the moment you
I'd
got up?
like 75% of what comes through my email gets deleted immediately or ignored and then deleted later,
Right. So
at least.
therein lies that kind of truth, right? Because here's the thing is that we make 35,000 decisions a day, and the vast majority of what we're doing is saying no to things. We're rejecting it. Unconsciously, we're saying, not interested in that, don't like that, not interested in that, doesn't make any sense, don't like the title of that. I'm not interested in that. I've already bought something like that. All of these things happen unconsciously. That's the power of the human brain. It's super complex, but it's only super complex relative to how it sees you as a person right now. So that's what your unconscious mind does. It's like a database of where it says not interested, not interested, not interested. So it's only when
Mhm.
something's relevant will you engage with it. So the reason that we get the double digit growth is that we know what is relevant to an audience, and therefore we know how to backtrack that, whether that's the products that you design, the language you use, the imagery, the content, the strategy, all of it needs to be fed from understanding your customers, the emotional meaning and the decision making. Whereas the vast majority of the world, the reason why they don't get double digit growth is that they're doing it top down. It's just stuck in a generational way of saying, we are a brand, we're going to go top down, and then the customers will decide what to engage with. That's really the architecture. They don't mean it as that architecture, but that's just my analysis of what goes on.
And so that's really interesting, isn't it? Because to my mind, what that speaks to is that things are complex clearly when we don't understand them. And typically they seem complicated if if we don't have the right tools to uncover the information we need to understand them, or indeed have the right lens to see it through, right? So that, molecular biology or chemistry, I wouldn't have a clue what I'm looking at, what the information's telling me. But a chemist could look through a microscope and define the meaning of life by looking at a microorganism, right? Because
Yeah.
they've studied, they understand how it works, and they know how to investigate it, right, and interrogate it. So they know the right questions to ask to bring the clarity needed. And is that kind of where you're at in terms of you've decoded almost like buying behavior, because you've understand what the right questions to ask are and how to interrogate people in a way that gives the answers you need.
Yeah, exactly that. You've summarized it exactly like that. So that we've got two products, right? And both have
Mm.
got they're different deployments in terms of different industries and complexity, right? But they both serve exactly that purpose of what you described, which is if you can understand how to decode decision making, which again comes
Mm.
back to understanding the relevancy that a person wants and the context of why they're going to buy and if they're going to buy. And it's not just about growth for a business. It's not just about more sales. It's about understanding where not to spend your time. Like if you're designing crappy products that aren't going to sell well, would you not want to know before you actually produce them? Or if you're doing,
Hmm.
if you're doing advertising campaigns that you don't know whether it's going to work or not, would you not want to know whether it's going to work before you do it? Or if you're advertising, which is Facebook's biggest problem in terms of its end user base, its clients, the people that give it the 50 odd million that billion that it makes every year, is they're
Mm.
advertising in this mud stick strategy. So that they might be sending, it might be, you could be an ideal person for a brand, right? Where you like the brand, but if they're sending you the wrong experience or the wrong products or the wrong imagery or the wrong style or at the wrong time, then you're not going to buy. And that's that kind of gap of what we're solving. And I wouldn't say we have solved it all because you're talking about such a complex kind of holy grail type scenario. We're not a million miles away from it, but there's still a lot of
Mm.
work to do. We're just doing it better, or we've got something that, as far as I can tell, the world doesn't have.
Well, and in that way, you're a pioneer, aren't you? I mean, you don't need to have all the answers. You need to start the momentum and then build that momentum as you go, and bring people along with you so that they can help decode it, and help make what you're doing even stronger and more widespread. I mean, you talked about a gap. Is that why you call the company Gap in the Matrix? Well, help me understand. I'm a movie buff, so I've always loved the idea of the name of your company, but give me an idea of what it means. Why is it Gap in the Matrix?
Yeah, so there's definitely a movie association, right? Which people tell me is not
Yeah,
is not good for branding, but there's a new Matrix movie coming out, so I might get away with it. But in
yeah.
the really short definition is that the world is a matrix of behaviors, right? So have you heard of the book *Sapiens*?
I have, yes, not read it though. It's a doorstop, isn't it? Massive.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I tell you why I loved it. Whenever I'm reading, it makes it difficult for me to ever take a break from work, right? Because it's my passion and my
Right.
obsession. But whenever I'm reading, I'm always looking at it with a lens of what does it mean to human behavior, whatever type of book that I'm
Mm,
reading and stuff, right? So I can tell you that
mm,
some of the biggest breakthroughs that I've ever made is not when I'm reading about science or mathematics. It's been very different things, like massively left field things, which is your classic kind of generalist problem solving way. And
mm-hmm.
Sapiens is basically from the eons of time of humans being around, it tells you the entire journey of human history. And the guy that wrote it is a history professor, and he's got that beautiful way. You know where people, I don't have it, but you know when people can say beautifully succinct things in 6 words that would take you a page.
Yeah.
He's got that, right? And he talks about this whole journey of what humans been on, and basically he's explaining, in my eyes, behavior upon behavior, beyond behavior, beyond behavior, which takes you into the modern world, and you can see that the whole thing is just a house of cards based on human error, and that's how I look at the world: is that you just got a whole complex thing of human behavior, but if you know how to interrogate it, which means that to the point that you were making that you summarized really well, it's not about having the answers, it's about having the right questions to ask, though, because if you know how to ask the questions, then you're a lot further forward than people that don't, obviously, right?
So absolutely. So that would suggest that a lot of the assumptions that brands and businesses make about their market, about their customers, and why they buy, and what potentially will make them buy more, are raw. Is
Yeah,
that fair?
yeah. I would say that it's very what I call 2D architecture for a 3D world. And
Oh, what does that mean?
yeah, I'll give you a couple of examples, right? So we humans are almost we're godifying software, right? Like
Right.
if you don't say that you've got software in your service, right, then you're going to win less business, right? For what you and I do, I have software within it anyway, and I
Mm-hmm.
know that you and I balance that out with some of the work that we do together and stuff, right? But in a general context, if
Mm-hmm.
we don't talk about software, people are less likely to believe it, which doesn't make any sense because humans are smarter and think deeper and know more than what a machine does, but we godify it. It's 2D architecture. That's what I call it. So we pump a load of money into Facebook, and if we get a 1.61% click through rate, then we're happy. Nobody's asking what it's like for the other 98.39% of people that get that experience. It's 4.832 trillion ads. But my real point about
Mm-hmm.
this gap is that if you think about this Sapiens book that I spoke about, think about the build of human history. So it wasn't always the case that the way that we think that the world operates at the moment wasn't always the way that it used to be. Like it used to be that if we go back like 100 years, well, over 102 years, women couldn't vote,
Mm-hmm.
right? It was a very male-dominated world. Whereas if you go back like 800 years or 1,000 years, it was very different. Women had positions of power and leadership and stuff. It's just the way that the humanity is in constant in that change of flux, right? But my point is, in the past
Mm-hmm.
200 years, most of the world, and I want to be really clever with language here because I've learned to be really clever with it because people can misinterpret this. Most of the world is
Mm-hmm.
built on he psychology, and he
Mm-hmm.
psychology is a learned behavior, right? So it's if you think about situations that you've been in where you've got a culture that's much more practical, rational, numbers focused, doesn't deal with an understanding of emotions, relationships, doesn't have that kind of continuity and togetherness of a culture. You know what I mean? That
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that is a he psychology situation, right? So it's
Mm.
not about every man having it. And I'm not saying that the world was only built by men in the past 200 years. What I am saying is that as a learned behavior, he psychology has dominated capitalism and it's dominated consumerism. And yet, when you examine what she psychology is, which again is a learned behavior, it's about emotional intelligence, it's about relationships, it's about connectivity, it's about connecting the dots. So a lot of what we focus on is the she psychology. So a lot of people can follow a textbook and a model and a method, but it's not going to get the emotional connection of what they need to do. And that's where the big gap is for me. So that's where the opportunity sits. And as much as we've got complex models and it took me 4 years and blah, 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 the reality
Mm.
is that a lot of it is just super logical, but it's still counterintuitive to engage with that logic relative to how society's been built.
Well, especially as you're kind of missing, as you say, a dimension of the information that you need, and it's not just that it's a dimension that you don't necessarily. It's not a problem that it's not there. It's actually one of the most important parts of the puzzle, isn't it? Because and I'm just to try to understand that. So 2D basically means that you're seeing part of the story, but you're not seeing the whole story. Is that right? And the 3D is actually the emotional part of the story, which can't be found, or it's something that technology can't appreciate for us.
Yeah, you're absolutely on the money. It's like it's simple questions, right? How does the person feel from the experience that you're giving them? Why does your customer buy from you?
Mm,
Why are you designing a product that way? Why is your advertising campaign like that? What's your proof that sits behind it? And a lot of people will say, "Well, we've done market research,"
mm,
and I could pick apart any market research. I know for a fact that a lot of people know that most market research is false and it doesn't have any truth behind it,
hmm
but that's the system that exists, so people
mm,
run with it. And I'll tell you why, because I don't want to just throw it out there like I'm having a go at market research, is that this is a really cool thing.
mm.
Did you know that between the 1930s until the 50s, mid 50s, in Madison Avenue, which is the advertising capital of the world during that time, so the golden age of advertising, every agency had a psychologist as an
Mm.
employee.
No, I didn't know that. So why did they have them? And then probably more importantly, why did they give them up?
Two great questions. So when I talk about mathematical psychology, if you were a potential client of mine, I was pitching you, I would say our superpower is mathematical psychology. It's really the numerical side of decision making. but we're not reinventing the
Mm.
wheel. We've got some new IP, but actually what we're doing is taking people back to the past, because in the 1930s to 1950s, every agency had a psychologist, and they had them because their pure targeting for the consumer world was females, because that was the decision making. And that's still true today, although males do more independent decision making about what they consume and stuff. It just depends, right? And that was why it was the golden age. This is the hidden gem. This is your Mad Men gold. Like, watch an episode of Mad Men
Mm.
and look at who is feeding Don Draper the insights. Look at how they're actually talking about it. You watch an episode of Mad Men and your mind will suddenly explode in a positive way, because they're talking about emotions, feelings, the definition, why people buy what they buy, right? And the reason they got rid of them is a classic he psychology overreaction. The advertising body in the 50s said, you know how you keep advertising that smoking's good for you? And they had all the adverts like
Mm.
dentists choose blah, 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 right? The advertising body said,
Hmm.
you've got to stop lying. So they overreacted in that classic overreacting sense, and they fired all the psychologists. That was the change in the agencies, because they'd associated the psychologist with this golden age of advertising, and too much of the advertising was based on false lies in the content, not the reason why they created the content. You see what I mean?
Yeah, that's so interesting, and there were potentially parallels with today, right? With the with the present crisis, with the way that we receive information about the pandemic and about the virus, especially from the government, and this idea of the science and the scientists, and you can just see that when there's backlash. Probably the people who are going to get it in the neck are the science and the scientists, right? Because they're the ones that are apparently ascribing meaning and bringing the truth of it to us. And clearly, it's a lot more complicated than that, and probably a lot less abstract.
Yeah, no, I think that you're right. I mean, in many respects, it's just rational stupidity. That's what
Yeah,
I'm eliminating a lot in the world. Is that I think your example about the crisis stuff is great. I mean, the one of the examples we did some analysis on, I ran a webinar about, was Sainsbury's, right? So Sainsbury's did the same thing that they've been
right.
doing once a year since 2017. They did a big night in, right?
Mm.
And market research passed the test, customer insights passed the test, and it got a lot less engagement than what it did before. And here's why. What's going on in the customer's mind during the crisis, right? Is that if you think about both of our lives at the moment, we're getting told, don't do this, don't see your friends, don't go out, don't book anything, just a whole load of don't, right? And
Mm.
what Sainsbury's did was they went to market, the big night in, and they said, if you give us money, we'll match that money. If you give up your loyalty
Mm.
that you earned from us, we will match it. On paper, market research, customer research says that it's great. The reality is that the mind, 35,000 decisions a day, rejects something that is further telling, somebody telling you one more thing that you have to do, one more thing that you have to give up. So it's had a very negative impact. And then on the other side, you had Lego. And when did Lego ever do anything that isn't awesome? Do you know what I mean? They're so well run. Very early in the crisis, Lego came out and said, we're going to give 50 million to disadvantaged children. It's going to be distributed via our foundation. They made it super clear, and that was the action. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that people have to give something away. It's much more about, if you understand the context of your customers, you wouldn't be doing what most brands are doing, which is, we'll donate this if you spend money with us. We'll do this if you do this. It's just
Mm.
lots of negative psychology. And there's tons of different examples like that. That's just my favorite one in terms of I think it's quite an easy way to explain the methodology issue.
I think that's an absolutely perfect example, isn't it? Because what it suggests is how important it is to understand how people feel about something. And if you're a fashion company, then you know how they feel about clothing and what it means to them. But then you've also got to understand how they feel about you and your products and what it means to them.
Yep.
And then the way that you communicate with them, then, and the kind of campaigning that you do, and as you say, the kind of work that you do in society all needs to rotate around that knowledge of what it is that your customer wants from you and the meaning that they take from the actions that you do in the market.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing to understand about any decision, 95% of them being based on emotion, and that comes from Harvard. And I'd love to know where the other 5% comes from, because I think it's
Sure.
100%. And I know I've said that before, and I'll keep saying it, right? is that when we make a decision, the reason it's based on emotion is that our emotions trigger rewards within inside our system, right? So when we buy clothing, we get as
Right.
much of a chemical rush from the enjoyment and then the moment when we purchase. And then from the first moment we wear it, is like an ever decreasing kind of half life. It's like a chemistry situation, right? So eventually you'll
Mm.
get to the clothing doesn't mean as much. You stop wearing it, then you charity shop it or eBay it or whatever, and then you buy stuff to replace it, right? But the main point is that you're getting a chemical release. It's not so much about the
Yeah.
product. It's not so much about the service. It's about what feeling you're giving people, because feeling is reward and reward is a chemical release. And positive negatives, so there's a lot of humans in this world that are playing a game of suffering. The media encourage us to play a game of suffering. It's all based on fear, which is why I don't watch the news or read newspapers, because there's no negative need for me to do that. Um,
Mm.
is that when people play a game of suffering, it's a thinking pattern where they're still getting the same chemical release, which is negative, right? So it's literally that duality of life, that meaning of life, is that our brains get conditioned to either think and do positives or negatives or a little bit of a mix of them, and it's all for the same reason because it gets a chemical release within us.
So that's really interesting, and I think that comes back to what we were discussing before, and the idea that of whether humans are complex or simple
Yeah,
to understand. Not simple in kind of their thought process, but in terms of they're quite simple to understand. Because actually, there's when it comes to what drives us, what motivates us to do different things or to make certain decisions, actually we're doing it on the basis of a very small set of motivators. It's not like there's this huge complex web of things we need to take into account. We're actually quite simple beings. We have very simple drives. And when we understand what those drives are and how they relate to us as a company, then actually we can communicate far more with far more impact with those people.
yeah, you're absolutely right. And one of the reasons why people end up in that situation is that the digital age has taught us to rush. It's taught us to feel
Mm.
short of time. And actually, the notion that we can measure everything, this idea of performance marketing, has meant that it's invaded too much of both our sales, advertising, marketing behaviors, as has the computer. The computers have made us more conscious of time, right? Like if you think back in the day, it wasn't that long ago. You're only talking just over 20 years ago, where you didn't spend your time like both of us are in front of our laptops right now, and if we look at the top right,
Sure.
what do we see? It's time. Each
Hmm.
each human checks their phone 67 times a day, so we're seeing time all the time. Everything's being driven by numbers, and humans are not good at dealing with time. If we become too conscious of time, it makes us think that we don't have time. So we actually waste
Right.
our time doing more things that mean that we don't have more time, which is the kind of ironic situation of human behavior. So it just doesn't help, really.
No, and that's absolutely right. And I mean, I read a theory recently. I can't remember what the book was I was reading, but this idea that actually we all understand to a certain degree that time is quite an abstract concept in that it doesn't really exist. Um, but actually, time doesn't come from external; it comes from internal. We're able to create time. I can't think of the number of times that actually when I haven't looked at my watch and I've made a journey and I've got somewhere and I've realized how quickly I've got there. And simply because I haven't been monitoring all the way along how long it's taking me to do so. So, yeah, it's very interesting. I love that idea around time. Martin, you talked about the fact that your approach and the proposition that you now run it's taking you a number of years to build and to put together and some really, some in-depth study. Um, when putting the approach together, who were you influenced by? What were kind of the theories that you have are putting into practice?
The I think the one of the most interesting books that I read was The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg.
Hmm.
Um, and that was one of like the final pushing points for me because I'd had these theories that I wanted to work on for a long time, but I was waiting for two things. I was waiting for the societal demand. So how open was society to understand and use and leverage emotions and decision making, and also that the scientific breakthroughs were there. And if you read The Power of Habit, it's such a simple process that the guy takes you through, but it's so well done. And that to me was my tipping point really to get on and want to do it. So that was really the book that helped me decide it. Is it the most life changing book you'll ever read? No, but for me personally, it was the context of it that
Mm.
helped me make that change.
Talked about market research
Yeah,
and how it's ineffective simply because it misses a fairly important dimension of information that we need in order to understand people and the way they make decisions. You also talked about Mad Men, which I love, and paints a wonderful picture of how advertising works, and how the advertising of today, where obviously market research is a major tool that's used. Something that we've talked about is actually you've convinced and converted a major, almost a legendary figure in the advertising world, Rory Sutherland, who helped build the global agency Ogilvy. What was the story behind that, and was it tough, kind of bringing him round to your way of thinking?
It's a great question, and you wouldn't actually know this, but what's really funny is that it really connects to the other question that you just asked me about, which was I went to an event, and I at the time I wasn't doing keynotes, but I was doing public speaking, right? The difference between the two. Obviously, you're getting smaller gigs, and keynotes is bigger. And he was doing a
Mm,
keynote in an event, and he got up and he spoke about why Uber actually worked, and he was the only person that I'd seen ever talk about that apart from me because it was to do with human
hmm.
behavior and control. And then he recommended The Power of Habit. And at that point, because I was very early
Wow.
in that research and didn't come from the industry, I didn't know who Rory was. I didn't know that he was a big name or
Mm,
came from Ogilvy, but Ogilvy was always a big passion of mine to get
mm,
into. So because I had that
mm,
kind of naivety, I just went up and spoke to him after. And then from that, we had an interesting conversation. I sent him a paper that I wrote. I went in, did some testing with Ogilvy, and then it just went from there. So it was just one of those serendipity moments where it's not like me to go up to speakers either, because normally I'm just like I don't like when people come up to me when they're being like a weird kind of fan. Do you know what I mean? Because that's what I was being with him. I was like, I literally went up to him and I was like, "Oh, you just said all this stuff that I think that I believe in, blah blah blah, and it's super interesting and blah blah blah." And I don't mind. Don't get me wrong. Like if anyone comes to an event that I'm speaking at, I love chatting to people and stuff. It's just when you get the fan person, it can feel a little bit creepy. Do you know what I mean? Because they're like, "Oh yeah," and that's what I did with him. But obviously, the paper and what I said resonated with him because from the first meeting, it was kind of we kind of chipped away at it over a few years, and now we have a call once in a while and stuff like that. He's a busy guy, I'm a busy guy, and we've done some work with
mm,
Ogilvy, which is really cool. So
mm.
there we go. That was it, really.
And I mean, he's given you a wonderful quote, isn't he? I mean, he's said something about, as far as he's concerned, there's very few people who do understand this realm, and I'm sure that there are going to be more and more. But actually, as far as he's concerned, that you're a very small group of people that really do get it and are going to be, as we said before, pioneering this part of the world.
Do you know what? It took me years to get to the point of getting this, and I got it late in 2019. So because of my tiny ego, I'm actually going to read it, right? Um,
Please do.
You can have all the micro-targeting tools in the world, yet if you fail to convince or persuade, it's all worthless. Martin is one of a tiny number of people in the world who understands that it's psychology rather than technology which offers the greatest potential to revolutionize market in the next 10 years and beyond. Wow. uh,
That's major, isn't it?
yeah. I mean, it was cool for me in multiple ways. One, I admire the guy a lot, so that was really cool. Two, he works at Ogilvy, which since I was a little kid, I didn't know much about advertising and marketing, but I had this association with Ogilvy, and I did lots of studies about Ogilvy himself, not the agency, but the man himself. And because I was
Mm,
I've always been kind of pure sales in what I do. Reading about Ogilvy, talking about um, the fact that marketing is about don't sell to a stranger. It's about deeply understanding consumer habits, and that every marketeer should be a salesperson. All things that I
mm.
think that the industry's forgotten about. So they were all anchor points for me. So it went from Rory into more research, more understanding, picking up the stuff I already knew about Ogilvy. So he was a big trigger point for me in ways that he won't necessarily understand, nor do I want to explain to them because they'll be in fanboy world again.
But what I love about the quote is he really picks up on everything that we've kind of talked about, which is this idea that technology clearly is important, but you have to understand people as well. And so you need that, it needs to be a broad mix. And together you can build that complete 3D picture that you've talked about. And if you rely on one or the other, you're just not going to get the information you need.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, one of my favorite sayings of yours is that understand self and liberate growth. What do you mean by that?
Great question. You're good at the questions, Alex, as ever. Just FYI, as a little side note, I've spoken about this before, but if you ever need really, really powerful money generating case studies, then Alex is the man to go to, amongst other things. Because if you rewind this by 10 minutes, just listen to the last few questions he asked me, and imagine if he was putting together the custom questions to ask your ones. Anyway, very, very good at that,
Thank you for that.
Alex. The thing for me is that both an individual, I've mapped a lot of individual psychology, like psychotherapy, hypnotherapy, psychiatry, all of it. And I've applied that against branding. Because if you think about
Mhm.
who you are as an individual, you've got a bunch of bias and millions of habits that you were never aware of and never going to be aware of. Like they came into your system when you were 4 years old, and now they leave your body in terms of how you behave, how you speak, and stuff like that. And you're never going to be aware of those things. So they come in unconsciously, they leave unconsciously, right? So it's quite difficult to understand yourself. Brands do exactly the same thing because here's the great connection, and I'll hopefully here's my test, Alex. Is let's see if I can make this simple to understand because it was a challenge for me over the years. Not that I knew that it worked, but explaining it was quite difficult. If you think about an individual
Mhm.
brain, those millions of
Yeah.
habits that I just spoke about, they're being managed mainly unconsciously within this database. And within that database, you've got your neurons, which is your thoughts, and then you've got your glial cells, which literally connect your thoughts together, right? Simple architecture. And
Right.
brands, if you apply the same kind of thinking to brands using that same neuroscience, you realize that the neurons are the people, or your employees, and therefore what they interact with and the decisions they make with themselves, with suppliers, with everything else, is then the interpretation of how they go to market. Meaning, the how to go to
Right.
market is like the individual, how they behave, their habits, the things that they're aware of, the things that they're not. Did I nail it? Did I get away with it?
You did, yeah. No, you absolutely nailed it. So I've got a follow-up question for you, though, which I think will help give the complete story, right?
Yep.
So clearly, we need to understand um, meaning and the habits, because through that we can understand behavior and what it is that's driving people to make the decisions that they do.
Yep.
Um, Something that you talk about is that importance of understanding those existing habits, almost like they're the hooks onto which you need to build your message and build your brand. Well, why is understanding those initial habit or the existing habits so important? Why are they almost like the road or the gateway to persuading people to take the action you want them to take?
Well, if you think about yourself as an individual, right? When you were 14 years old, you were very open. You were still learning about the world. You're trying to figure yourself out. You're trying to move into maturity and puberty and then into adulthood and things like that, right? And then by the time you're 21, you're getting a better idea about yourself. You still don't understand the world, but at least you're trying to pretend to the world that you know what you're doing, right? And then when you're 28, you generally meet your partner. By 35, you might have a kid or two if that's what you've chosen to do in life. By your 42, you're starting to figure out world. My point is that the brain works in 7 year cycles, right? And as you get older, the brain's job is to automate as much as possible from the very youngest age, all your habits, what you do, what you engage with, your decision making, all of it. So as you get older, it's not that people become more fixed of mind, it's that the brain's doing more of its job. So it's automating more and more as possible. So the idea of you evolving as you get older is much more difficult. Think about any time that you and I, being a relatively similar age, have been introduced to new technology, a new social media platform, a new thing that we have to learn. We find it more frustrating or more difficult as we get older, right? Not just you and I, but people in general. Um, with that being the case, think about a brand. When a brand is born, it's much more open to how it does things. And then over time, it
Mhm.
gets more stuck in its ways and more stuck in its ways. And I found that the fashion industry is one of the most least or one of the least advanced industries I've come across, quite similar to banking, in that it's quite stuck in its ways of how it does things. And a lot of the times it's kind of got a top down architecture where the founder or the creative team or the design team is dictating too much, and it's dictating too much based on what it used to know, not what its market currently wants. And that is a really quick whistle
Mhm.
stop tour about how brands kill themselves, basically.
Right, right, right. And I think that's interesting from a kind of the work that we do in B2B. Uh, we're always very mindful of existing habits because, as you said, the brain is an efficiency machine, right? So it establishes routine, it establishes habit in order to propel people forward and get them through the day in the most efficient way possible. So in order to offer them something that you want them to do, and to offer them something that you want them to get involved in, if it's a product or a service, then in some way you've got to find how it hooks into their current behavior in order to move them forward and potentially into another direction. Because, as you say, we don't like change. We're very resistant to change. So, and I think the challenge that a lot of people that I speak to when I'm first having a chat with them, new business prospects, is that they're trying to offer somebody something that's going to change their world. Now, that might have very positive connotations, but of course, it requires a huge amount of change, which people are going to be very resistant to. So, even if they love the look of it, the thought of the necessary habits that are going to be needed, or the change in behaviors that can be required, will put them off it. And so you've got to, so understanding those existing habits, that's your pathway, right? That's where you need to hook your road into, and then lead people along what they feel is familiar, and then take them into a place where they feel comfortable enough to change that behavior over time. One of the things that we found is really powerful in the creation of content, and really helps to connect it to the audience, and help them to not just understand, but actually take on board a lot of the thoughts and ideas that are being communicated and offered in that content, is to give them some actions they can take that will help them achieve immediate momentum, right?
Yep.
So not massive things, not things that will give away huge amounts of IP, but kind of low calorie actions that they can actually take on their own, which will give them perceivable change, right? Even if that changes the way they think, or it disrupts an assumption they've got, and creates a new reality for them, right? And often, once they've got that power, they've enjoyed the power of that change, they'll then tell somebody else about it, and then they're more open to experimenting with larger bits of change, and doing other things that they may not be used to, or may feel a little bit uncomfortable about. So if you were talking to one of your clients and you were starting out a relationship, what are kind of the first things that you would get them to do themselves that help them get into the right mindset? Well, what is the kind of low calorie actions they could take that will give them a little bit of momentum towards where they need to be to really grasp and take advantage of gap in the matrix?
I get them to look at their definition of why their customers buy from them.
Why do you do that?
Why do we do that? It's a good question,
Mm.
actually. Is that what you're trying to actually get inside of is help them start understanding, and also help me start understanding where their mindset is at the moment. So,
Mm.
how engaged are they? How much do they actually understand? Because obviously, we need to figure out, for us delivering a service and for them accepting that service, they're going to have to recognize how close or how far away they are from actually understanding why their customers buy from them. And it's
Mm.
also a very good it's a good strategy, whether we're present, which sometimes we are, or whether it's just their team on whiteboards, which is some it just depends on the client, right? It's a really
Mm.
good strategy for them to start exploring it for themselves, so that they get a really good idea about whether they're in a good place or not, and whether they've got any gaps with it. And
Mm.
then the next thing that I give them, so it's all questions, is what problem do you solve?
Right.
And I challenge them to write down as many bullet points about what they've got, put themselves in the customer's mindset. What problem are you solving for them? And you'd be amazed at how many fashion people say keeping them warm. And if that was the case, then everybody would be walking about wearing Donny tracksuits or shell suits and stuff like that. But they're not.
They were at one point, weren't they?
Yeah, yeah, probably. I think I had a Hummel one because we were poor, and I was just a bit shit when I was little. But we get them to look at that, and then depending on the market, and meaning that depends the results we get back, is we say, which habit are we dealing with? What is your customer's existing habits? And you'd be amazed that nobody can answer that off the cuff. Nobody knows that, because it's
Mm.
actually quite complex, right? If you think about
Mm.
somebody's habit when it comes to shopping, you can make that really simply. You could kind of guess that, right? But if you think about what we're actually asking, is what is the person's habit when it comes to shopping with you? And then you're into product preferences, how they buy, which channels, which medium, which things like that. And you'll realize quite quickly when you do that exercise how much your brand is dominated by digital thinking when the reality is that
Mm.
most of your purchasing is not happening digitally.
Mm. I think that's really interesting because actually, it's really about gaining an understanding that you and perhaps filling in that third dimension, isn't it? With simple questions that they can go and ask their customers that they've probably never asked before, and just by asking those questions and getting the feedback, they'll start seeing themselves as well as their customer in a different way.
Yeah, and I mean the reality is that don't get me wrong, like we've got I don't know, like 30 odd 37 case studies or something like that, and we've worked with
Mm.
50 odd brands, so like large corporations, enterprises. We've worked with lots of startups, we've worked with software, consumer, fashion, banking, platforms, like everything you could imagine so far. And I've yet to see anybody that actually understands their customer. Even to the point
Mm.
where I hear a lot of defensiveness, particularly from B2B people, where they'll talk about the
Mm.
fact that they've got personas and stuff. And the
Mm.
challenge I would give, if you've got a persona that says, we serve Dave, Dave is 23 years old, and Dave likes this and doesn't like this, is just actually read that. Think about the words that I just said, and you'll realize that you're describing a person, not a target audience. And it's a really common negative thing that exists within the world, within the marketing world at the moment.
Yes, you know that I completely am on board with. It's something that we're very specific about in the work that we do in terms of the kind of questions that we ask. And I think in the same way that you're asking questions to fill in that third dimension, we're doing the same thing. So we couldn't really care less what they have for breakfast or how many pets they've got or how many children that they know about and maybe don't know about. But it's what we're interested in is who they are, what they want, and why they want it, and what's getting in the way of them getting it, because that's typically the trigger point, right, for the purchase. But then we really want to understand uh, how they made that buying decision, because that's the stuff, that's the storytelling that we really need to understand. So what were the different kinds of services that they considered, and who were the different suppliers, and perhaps even more importantly, who did they choose? Clearly our client at that time, because that's why we're asking the question. But how did they disqualify the others, and for what reasons? Because this is all kind of gems of information that you can then use in your marketing to displace your competition, while at the same time building yourself up in front of your customer and your target market. So I completely buy into that, and I think we so you very kindly talked about the way I ask questions earlier, but they always have a very specific goal. I know what kind of information I'm looking for, and the value that having that feedback provides to a company, and when they're looking to sell to more people like that. And it sounds like you do it in a far more in-depth way, and you're looking at psychology from a very deep well of understanding. But the principle's the same, isn't it? You ask good questions, you get the right answers, and then you can use those answers to get people to buy and buy again.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got it. I mean, you're absolutely nailing it. And of course, there's a lot of complexity to it. It's not about we're not just saying that. Oh, here's Alex, and he knows how to ask good questions, and Martin's built a model just about questions. It's about understanding the meaning that sits behind it. Like, what are you actually trying to extract from people? Because it's really easy for people to do customer insights that they think answers the question, and it doesn't work. That's the problem, is that you're not designing your strategy around the right things. So we're just talking about one lens that's going to get you a much better way for people to engage and buy your service, which is your customer's voice, right? But there's so much more
Mm,
depth to it. It's interesting.
yeah. I love that, and it's been absolutely brilliant. I mean, thank you so much. I mean, I know that it's been a bit of an interrogation today, which is a bit different from the norm, and you're certainly going to get your revenge on me next time when we're gonna turn the tables. But that was fantastic, Martin. Thank you so much for incredible insights.
Brilliant questions as ever, Alex. Thank you.